speaker. Our next speaker will give a unique opportunity for everybody to have a glimpse into how Ireland is working towards commercializing science. What is their startup scene like, and what can we learn from the Irish? From idea to business, the case of academics. Gearoid Mooney, Division Manager of Research and Innovation at Enterprise Ireland. Welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about myself, the environment I work in, and the organization I work for, because in order for you to figure out for yourself whether there's any value in the points of view I bring or the examples that I'm about to use, it's probably best you understand my prejudices and backgrounds before we begin. So I'm Gearoid Mooney. I'm an engineer. It's probably the only thing I'm actually qualified to be. I have actually been through 2 startup teams very early in my career, probably back in the Jurassic period, but it has given me an insight and some scars that I can rely on to help me to do my job today. So, quick word about Ireland. So we're a 4.9 million population. We're an island off the coast of Europe. We're English speaking, definitely committed to the EU, and we're a member of the Euro. So that's the general environment for Ireland. For Enterprise Ireland, we're a government-funded agency. For some people, that's immediate. Okay, we're going to get some spin here. But let me explain what it is we do. So our aim is to look after the growth of Irish-owned companies in global markets. We primarily work with SMEs. We have a number of large client companies, but the vast majority of our clients are SMEs. In European terms, we probably viewed as a hybrid agency because we've integrated the sales and marketing, the business development, new company creation, and innovation all into one agency. And that happened over a number of years. And our last merger to create this entity is probably about 15 years ago. So we've been working like this for a while, and it works really well for us in a small economy like ours, where it's a very short reach to get to everybody. Our annual budget is about $500 million a year. About a third of that we spend on innovation supports. And in terms of those innovation supports, the kinds of things we do, we invest in new companies and new company creation. We look at one-to-one innovation supports for more mature companies who are looking to have the ambition to scale. We have a number of innovation supports then that focus on clusters of companies working together on common problems. And in addition to all of that, we also have the national mandate for research commercialization, the promotion of participation in Horizon Europe. And yes, we even carry out the duties of a space agency because Ireland's a bit too small to have a standalone space agency. So Mr. Ashbacher, who you heard from yesterday, would be very, very familiar with this. In terms of the funding piece, which is probably the item that will interest most people here today, we invest in young startup companies primarily through taking direct equity stakes and co-investing with private sector and promoters. When the companies move to more mature stages of growth in that kind of 5 years plus, we tend to predominantly have a more grant-based approach. And as well as all of those, we have a set of soft supports built around them to help companies with their scaling agenda and their ambition. One other role that we've been handed by our national government is we're also a funder of funds. So following the smart model from Israel that was created many, many years ago, we co-invest in venture capital funds so that follow-on investment is available, as well as our direct seed investment. So just a brief bit then about the general startup environment in Ireland. So last year, 2021, we supported 125 new startup companies and invested what is for us a record of 48 million euro in those companies. About 15% of those companies on an annual basis come from the research system and are inevitably and welcome deep tech companies. What we've noticed in comparing those deep tech companies to the general cohort of companies is that they tend to have better survivability, believe it or not. They tend to be able to raise money more efficiently, and their survival rate is superior to companies started at the same time as them in that general cohort in any given year. So the general investment scene in Ireland last year was pretty good in spite of pandemics. So there was a record of overall of 1.19 billion invested in tech companies right throughout the system. And while that was a record and is really, really welcome, there are still weaknesses at seed stage, which means there's still a role for Enterprise Ireland. Just to give you an idea on an annual basis or kind of what our returns are on that, we get back somewhere over the last couple of years just north of about 100 million per annum from the investments that we make. So it's not only us that look at our track record. PitchBook has ranked Enterprise Ireland as first in the world of venture capital investors. Now, for the venture capitalists in the audience, before they lose their breakfast, we're not a venture capitalist in the true sense. It's nice to be recognized for the number of deals that we do, but our return is getting new companies started, getting employment in our economy here in Ireland, having those companies that we've supported increase their spend in the economy. It's a key measure for us. And also add to our export record. Now, as well as all of that, of course, we do make a return, as I mentioned earlier. It's of the order of 2 to 3x the money that we've invested. But that's not the important factor for us. We invest more on the basis that if there is an upside in the future, that we would participate in it, but we're not driving it in the same portfolio way as a normal VC would. If I look at where our deep tech companies come from out of the research system, what I'm showing you now is a map of the research system. Now, this is not meant to be a linear journey, because a lot of experts have criticized me in the past for putting this up and saying, oh God, that makes everything look terribly simple. It's more of a map and the supports that are available. But the important point for us is that Enterprise Ireland's role is in that last journey to market. So lots of other organizations, or some other organizations in Ireland, such as Science Foundation Ireland, they invest in the scientific excellence that creates the basis that we can work from. And there's also really, really good, strong contributions from Horizon Europe and predecessor European funding programs going into building that science base that we can then work with. We work with them in two ways. I'll briefly mention the first one because it's about us connecting existing companies on the island who have a particular technical challenge with talent in the research system who are willing to work on that close to market challenge. And we both make introductions and do a bit of funding on that. But more in keeping with the theme of today's conference, we have our commercialization fund. So it's that black line that runs all the way from the research system to market. Our job is to de-risk the investment. And over the years, we've come to the conclusion from an operational point of view, both as a funder of young startups and as an observer and an interactor with the research system, is that if something is coming out of a lab or out of a research team in a university or an institution, it's probably best to incubate that there for as long as you possibly can until it has reached a standard that's acceptable and ready for investment by the private sector. Because if our experience prior to this would have been if you spin out too early, you end up in an environment where not only are you trying to figure out your commercial plans and your commercial approach and pivot and respond to market, but trying to do that at the same time as de-risking your technology is a real challenge. Now, I'm not saying we've perfected it, but we've a pretty good system in operation. So if you look at that commercialization fund, it's not just about funding the additional tech development and de-risking it. It also explores the market possibilities and even does some trials with trial customers before the project is ready, I think, for private sector investment. We fund about 50 of those projects a year, 50, and we spend typically somewhere between 100,000 and 700,000 on each project. We also, when we're selecting the projects, it's done on a competitive basis. We get huge input from the private sector in trying to help us pick the right projects to back. The other thing to point out is that commercialization fund is a partnership between our organization and the research team. It's not a, here's the money and come back in a few years' time and tell us whether it's done good things or not. We're with the research group lockstep all the way through the project. And to that, I'd like to point out maybe on the left-hand side of the screen, starting in bottom left, we have a team of commercialization specialists whose sole job it is to work with those projects that we've backed on that journey towards trying to determine if they can be de-risked enough to get the private sector interested. And also probably as big a challenge for us is to make sure that they're de-risked enough so that our colleagues in our regular startup funding teams are willing to accept them as clients. And that's a pretty hard audience, believe me. But as well as the money, it's also important to note that there are a lot of introductions, there's a lot of interaction with potential partners, potential customers, and they're the kind of things we help out with. Examples of that is we have the mentor scheme, which is good for helping to mentor young, vibrant research teams who are trying to take that first step into commercialization. But in quite a number of cases, mentoring is not sufficient because mentoring actually relies that there's at least one person in the team who has the capability and maybe experience and knowledge to act on the good mentoring advice they're getting. So while mentors are good, we found we've got this other category of what we call business partners. And business partners are people who've had C-level jobs in other startups and other companies in the past who are willing to look for their next startup gig with one of our research teams. And we screen them, we interview them, and we try and match and introduce them to suitable research teams and let them pick the projects that they want to run with themselves. It's been incredibly successful insofar as when that clicks and that relationship works, you get amazing results. And I'll talk about a case study in a minute that really demonstrates that. But it is hard. It's hard because it depends on that whole human dynamic, because you can't just implant a stranger in a research team and hope everybody gets on really well. And the real challenge is making sure that the matchmaking goes well and that people like each other, quite apart from the business opportunity, but they like each other well enough to actually move on and raise investment and create a company together. We also have, it's not on this particular map, but we have investigated and trialed and experimented with getting entrepreneurial talent into the heart of the research team while working on our commercialization fund projects. And if anybody is interested, it's worth your while looking at an industrial way of doing that. We have a program called BioInnovate in the west of Ireland, which is largely modeled on the Stanford Innovate project, but I would argue is much more impactful because of the environment it's gone into with commercialization fund. And you can see why over the last number of years, the number of medtech startups in particular have really increased as a proportion of our startup community. So to take you on to that promised case study. So we had a project called Feedhenry, and I'm not even going to get into the name because it involves one of our uniquely national sports and the sports personality connected with that. But it actually started life as an FP6 project, which kind of dates it. That just shows how long some of these concepts and ideas can take to incubate. So out of that FP6 project and the spend on that and the working with our partners on it, they came up with a really, really interesting mobile technology of their own that they thought, yeah, we've got a bench model here and we think this could be commercial. So we evaluated it. They applied to us. They competed and they won a commercialization fund project from us. And that developed really, really well. And we attempted to spin it out at that stage and it just didn't fly. And I think some of it was technology and some of it was people. Then they persuaded us, again through a competitive mechanism and lots of private sector evaluation, that actually we want to take a second run at this. We invested in a second project. They tried to spin it out. Again, it didn't fly. They tried to license it to a mature company. Didn't quite take. The difference was bringing in one of those business partners that I mentioned earlier, a serial entrepreneur who had built and sold a company of his own before, and had also been at C-level in a couple of large companies. He came in. Within 6 months, he said, "You have a brilliant technology platform here, but guys, you're aiming it at the wrong application and you're not explaining it the right way." So within that 6 months, he'd raised the seed round for the company and joined the company himself. Another 12 months after that, they raised a 7 million round with some strategic investors. Within 32 months, Cathal Madline had led the research team to an exit at 63 million euro. They were bought by Red Hat. So from the entrepreneur's point of view, from the research team's point of view, and the research institution and Enterprise Ireland as an investor, we all did reasonably well out of it. It was a really, really good story for us. It's made even better because that company still here. Red Hat, as you're probably aware, was subsequently bought by IBM. But the actual unit, that mobile unit, is still a feature of IBM's business lineup. And not only is it a feature, but the headcount has grown, going back to that jobs interest that we have as a national government agency, and has stayed in Ireland. And that's the case. The vast majority of the exits we've seen in this space have stayed in Ireland. And they've stayed in Ireland because they're feeding off the research talent that developed this deep tech idea. So while it's lost out of our portfolio and we got a bit of cash in, it's still been hugely beneficial for the company or for the country, and has been a really good demonstrator as to how this can work to bring economic prosperity. Final point on this particular case study is that the company is in the southeast of Ireland, which by rights is not a great place to actually develop a software business, but it is because of the research team that's based in the Waterford Institute of Technology, which has recently amalgamated and grown to become a technological university within the last year in Ireland. So that's the case study. I'd like to quickly talk about the results from some of the other cases we've had. So over the last decade, we've about 190 active spinouts from research. Active spinouts being ones that have acquired investment or trading employed people. There are over 1,200 people employed by those companies. And I say over because we have the economic data on half of them exactly. And for that half, we can see, without any grossing up of numbers, 1,200 employees. They also spend 124 million a year in the economy. And that is growing, as is the number of active spinouts getting added. And the number of failures at the other end is quite small. So we're looking at quite a steep rise in terms of economic impact. Now, none of those numbers include the additional 30 companies that have been acquired. And in terms of our investment, we made about 24.5 million euro net out of those investments in those deep tech spin-out companies. And you might go say, well, that's not very impressive. VCs do better. Of course they do. But remember, we're a seed investor. We're there at the early stage. We don't tend to follow our money. We do get diluted. And in addition to the money that we made, there's been almost a $500 million return to other investors. So I'd like to finish up by just quickly going through some of the learnings that might be of interest to you. So investing in the research commercialization system has economic impact. Our evidence would show that it's also profitable. It is, however, challenging because you're working with people, deep tech, emerging thoughts, emerging technologies, and lots of pivots along the way. It does take time. You look at that example, that's been cooking since FP6, and it took till 2014 for it to actually have an exit. In our view, it requires dedicated support and a consistency. If we'd had a ministry funding us to do this activity who decided to examine our activities after years 2, 3, 4, or 5, they would have closed it. The impacts are in the long term. It does need resources. It does need people and money. It does need a vibrant research system to play off of. A key point is people must want to do it. And I don't only mean the researchers. I mean, the institution wants to push it and see it as part of the benefits that it brings. The government must want to do it. And you must have people around it, entrepreneurs who are willing to do it. Also, optimally, it's not always the case, it's good to have both push and pull on the technology. Push as in you've got a really deep tech, scientifically excellent team you can work with a concept that looks really, really interesting. Pull from the market side where the scientific piece is interesting, but at the end of the day, it's profitability that matters. Thank you.